My name is Isidora Sidorovska, and I will be hosting today's session. And I have with me Marcel Lauzier from the Lawson Foundation, Julian White from the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and Ruth Crammond from the United Way GT. The session earlier today, we presented a lot of research done around how have grant-making foundations responded to the COVID-19 crisis so far. And the session today will focus a bit more on foundations themselves. So here we will hear from foundations themselves around what has been their understanding of the crisis so far, what are some of the challenges that perhaps some of their grantees have been facing, and how has this informed their future priorities as we move through this process. Just a quick reminder of the housekeeping rules. So we will have everyone who is not presenting turn off their video and their audio. And if you have questions, just feel free to enter them in the chat. And we will have the three presentations back to back with a Q&A session in the end. I will give further guidance on how you can ask questions or provide us with comments later on. Now I would like to give the floor to Marcel Lauzier from the Lawson Foundation to give us his presentation. Thank you.
Merci, merci Isidora. Bonjour tout le monde, good afternoon. I thought I would talk about four things today. First, I'll give a bit of a sense about the Lawson Foundation, who we are, what we do. But then I'd like to talk about the value and the role of operational funding to build resilience. I really am going to put the emphasis on resilience coming out of the pandemic. I'm going to also talk about the particular role I think that private foundations can play and should be playing in terms of resilience and operational funding, and then maybe give a few examples of what we're doing in the Lawson Foundation. So really, I'm going to look at the why for operational funding, the how, and then the what. Lawson Foundation, we're a national private family foundation. We've been around for over 60 years. Family is still very involved, fifth generation now at the table of the board. London-based originally, and when I arrived at the foundation in 2014, we moved to Toronto, and with my colleagues at the Counseling and Laidlaw Foundation, we created Foundation House, which is a great collaborative working space. Our areas of interest are focused around healthy development of children and youth. We're also quite involved in social finance and impact investing as a complement to our granting. And we were one of the early signatories of the Declaration on Reconciliation, which is something we're very committed to and something that is influencing pretty much everything that we do at the foundation. So looking at the why, looking at operational funding and looking at the why. The first thing I want to state is that building resilience, and you all know this, is something that is not done, that actually is done over time. It's really hard to build. Organizations, particularly when organizations mostly get project or program funding. And I know from my own experience running organizations, I was on the other side of the table for most of my career, that turning on the lights, paying for the non-sexy stuff that is often invisible. I'm thinking here of governance, of paying decent salaries and benefits, and looking at tech support, strategic planning, business development, etc. All of that stuff that should allow an organization to be really effective in delivering on its mission, well, it's often overlooked by funders. And I think that is actually looking at how we can do this differently is actually key to building resilience. And I think that the pandemic has really highlighted this. I'm thinking here of all of the organizations out there that have been struggling because they have very little support for their operational stuff. I'm thinking here, for example, of all those organizations that have faced some really tough HR issues, having to let people go, looking at severance packages, even when that's possible. How do you do this well in order to be fair, but also to protect yourself? There are, liability issues. Or how about understanding how you really do good cash flow projections that are so key to understanding where you are as an organization? And what about the ability to pivot with new technology to support communities in new ways? These organizations clearly need access to legal, to financial, to technology supports that they simply don't have. And the pandemic hopefully has put a spotlight on that. At least I think it has, and I really hope that it has made and put a spotlight on it. You know, meaningful operational funding from foundations can allow organizations to bring in, you know, the right expertise at the right time, and I think it can make a huge difference between surviving and shutting down. I'm thinking here also, you know, about some organizations that would benefit from some serious restructuring, you know, even mergers, amalgamations, not for everyone, but in some cases it may be the way to go. You know, you need to be able to bring the right expertise, and there are costs linked to that, and those kinds of costs are not typically captured through project or program funding. I should say here, kudos to the Matart Foundation that launched a few months ago, a great program to help organizations think around the issue of restructuring, mergers, amalgamations, and supporting them to do that. I think that's really important if that's what needs to happen. I came into the charitable sector decades ago, I had to say. At that time, the idea was that you were supposed to do everything with nothing, you know, through passion, through dedication, through goodwill, was supposed to allow you to do everything you needed to do and do it well. And the reality is that I think we worked really hard and did some really good stuff, but I don't think, in my view at least, that we never really accomplished as much as we could have had accomplished had we had the right supports. And the worst thing is, I don't think that has changed very much over the decades. I think we're still very much in a very similar position in terms of funding grassroots organizations, but organizations generally. And I think we need a serious paradigm shift. We've been talking about this for a long time. This is not new. And my hope is that the pandemic, by putting a spotlight on it, will hopefully bring in some change. On a bit of a different front, but related, is I'm a big believer in the role that charities and nonprofits working on the front line can play in the development of good public policy. And that's another good reason to look at operational funding, to support that meaningful and effective public policy advocacy work. And foundations actually, you know, more and more are providing support for particular public policy or advocacy activities. But I think we need to realize as foundations that it's really rare to see significant public policy shifts within the confines of a 3-year grant or even a second 3-year grant. Way too often, the reality is that playing the long game is the only way to bring about transformational change. There are exceptions for sure, but generally public policy happens very, very slowly. So if you're looking at good public policy or public policy advocacy, it's not just about developing the right evidence and the right connections. You need to do that, but it's constantly refreshing the data, constantly refreshing that evidence, rebuilding the connections as governments and officials change. And it's also about waiting for just the right conditions, you know, just the right environment, and for that proverbial window of opportunity to open up. So if organizations are to have any success, they need to have the resources to be engaged for, I think, long periods of time. But unfortunately, as funders, we can quickly get bored and want to move on to something else. So I think we need to think about this. We need to think about that long-term operational funding that's going to help organizations do the public policy work they need to do. So for some of those reasons, and you can name many others, I think we need to think long and hard about how we better support our partners with the work they need to do and build their resilience to be able to do it in the long term. So for me, that's the why. Now, if I look at the what and the how, what particular role private foundations can play, I think there's no doubt in my mind that as private foundations, we can take risks that governments or corporate funders simply can't take. Let's be frank, we don't have the same kind of constraints that other funders have. And within the funding ecosystem, I think that's huge, something that we need to be better capitalizing on. So what does that mean? I think it means, at least in part, that we embrace trust in our partners in a very new way. And this is what trust-based philanthropy should mean and what it's all about or should be about. I think we have the ability and we have the time to build strong relationship with our partners that are based not on a top-down model, but a collaborative model where we trust that the partner that we know well, that has a proven track record, knows what actually needs to be done. It certainly means that we need to think more deeply about what trust-based philanthropy means and what it looks like. And for sure, this is an evolving thing, but I do know that one key piece is to look at our application processes, right? Are processes really the best way to get the best ideas and support the most meaningful work? And what about reporting requirements? Sure, as foundations, we want to make sure we secure good data to understand the impact. We want to ensure that dollars are used appropriately. But here again, let's be frank, how many foundations are really using that information in a way that is making a real difference to the issues we're trying to address? And I'm not suggesting by any means that we move away entirely from reporting or that reports are not helpful, but rather that I think reporting needs to be more meaningful, and I think it needs to be meaningful for both the funder and the organizations reporting. I think that is linked to resilience. I think we need to be clearer on what the intent is, and we need to be open to a variety of ways of doing this in conversation with our partners. And by the way, ONN last year or the year before did some wonderful work on helping us rethink what evaluation should be about and the importance of learning through evaluation. And let's not forget that, that the time that our partners are taking to write reports is time taking away from delivering on their mission. We say that often, but I'm not sure we're always acting on that. And I think more reporting, particularly unhelpful reporting, really does nothing to build the resilience that we need. I'd like to say a few words also about the relationship between resilience and funding of key infrastructure organizations, or we could call them umbrella organizations in the charitable nonprofit sector. I mean, thinking of organizations like ONN in Ontario, or Imagine Canada at the national level, or Pillar Nonprofit in London. As funders, if we really care about resilience of the sector and of the organizations we're funding, I think we need to look at how we support those organizations. I think too often we see them outside of scope, but I think it's through their work that the nonprofits that we're actually supporting are going to be more successful. We know that organizations are going to have a greater impact if they're working in an enabling environment that allows them to really deploy their resources and their expertise to really serve their communities. And that's the role of these infrastructure organizations. It's about conducting research and providing good data. It's about advocating to government about regulations and funding. We saw that big time during the pandemic. It's about connecting with Canadians, about telling the story about the role that charities actually play. And it's about helping organizations be better governed. So all of this for me is key to resilience in our sector. As funders, let's not look at how we can let's look, I should say, at how we can better support this work. This is what we often think as unsexy work. And one last thing that I'll mention, and that I think is the ability for us as foundations to facilitate sharing of space and how that can build resilience. Sharing space, whether like-minded organizations, not for everyone, but ever since my experience at Foundation House, I've become a huge believer in the power of everyday connections with colleagues who are working on similar issues, similar challenges. My experience has shown me how powerful proximity can be. And I think it'd be great to see ourselves as foundations look at ways that we could support organizations to think about and allow them to come together to share space. And now for the what. A few examples of what Lawson is doing. I thought to talk about a few things we're doing, not because we're doing anything better than others, but simply because that's what I know best. Not suggesting either that we're doing everything right, far from it, but we are in constant evolution of how we do our work, like most foundations we work with or admire. So I think there's a lot of momentum for change within the foundation world. I think a lot more than people think. We're just not very good at telling that story. Anyway, that being said, I think we need to continue to challenge ourselves and get our partners to challenge ourselves. So few examples. Operational funding, trust-based approach is really where the foundation is going. Increasingly, we're looking at providing that kind of funding so that our organizations can make a key contribution to the impact areas they're working with. We recognize the importance of supporting overhead costs. Of course, we've done that for a long time, but this is going further in terms of grants being essentially dedicated to support operations, unrestricted in a way, because if there's one thing that over time will really help build resilience, it's going to be access to this kind of funding. Organizational capacity grants, this is something we're trying out right now, helping organizations access dollars from the foundation that will allow them to do some of the really difficult stuff for which they may not have the skills, which is normal because they can't have a skill sets in everything, but looking at providing HR support, legal support, communications, finance, technology, governance, all of these kinds of things that can make a big difference in terms of organizational capacity. And the dollars to bring in expert advice. Also, we're looking at how we can do that, allow organizations to really tap into, whether it be academic, whether it be consultants, whether it be the private sector, around issues like marketing, like strategic clarity, like business development. These are skill sets that normally, organizations on the ground may not have, and we're looking at how we can support that. Impact investing, looking at how our impact investing tool can be used as a complement to our grants. And in some cases, it may be better for an organization to get an investment than to get a grant. So how can we look at that to build resilience? And a few years ago, two last things. A few years ago, we undertook with the Counseling and Laidlaw Foundations, our partners at Foundation House, something called the Grantee Perception Survey. And I think that was probably one of the first times in Canada that was done. I think Trillium may have done something similar, but that was about turning to our grantees to better understand how they can improve their processes and procedures, but using a third party to help us get some really honest and candid advice from our grantees about how we could help them and do things better. And I'll end with the concept of what we've been calling mutual accountability, which is for us a new concept. It's about recognizing that, we should also be accountable to our partners, to our grantees. So in our letters of agreement now, we don't only talk about what's agreed in terms of desired outcomes, reporting and payment schedules, but we go a lot further. And we've added a new component to the letter that spells out very clear that we are also accountable and that we will do what we can to support them. So in that, we commit to remaining really flexible with regard to their goals and their budgets. We respond promptly to the inquiries. We agree and commit that we will connect them to other funders, to potential partners, to policymakers, and we will support their communications effort to get their story out. That's a way for us, I think, to show that we're accountable, but also, I think, to build resilience. So in conclusion, I'd simply say that there are a lot of private foundations, a lot that we can do to build the resilience, that we are starting to do more, and there's a lot more room to continue to improve, and hopefully we're going to hear from the sector about how we can do that. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcel. This was truly inspirational, and I think that we can for sure discuss some of these things a bit more during the Q&A at the end of the session. I would now like to invite Julian White from the Ontario Trillium Foundation to give us her view on some of these topics as well.
Thank you. Okay, so I shall share my screen and introduce you to my headshot, which looks much better than my work from home look. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we at OTF have been trying to use data available to really kind of ground the decisions that we make about how to continue to serve the sector as things change. My subtitle is trying to and learning some lessons, because we, as we become a bit more, I think, day-to-day reliant on data to help point us in the right direction, we're realizing where some of those shortcomings are. And I'll kind of end with like some thoughts on where we could go, or at least where OTF is trying to go. So just a little background, I think most people are familiar with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. So we're an agency of the Government of Ontario. Depending on the year, we grant between 100 and 120 million to the nonprofit and charitable sector. This is through two funds. So we have our community investments, which is through the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, Culture Industries. And that's our larger fund. It would be between like 80 and 95 million a year. And then we also have our Youth Opportunities Fund, which is focused on funding and supporting grassroots organizations that are particularly either working with Indigenous or Black youth, or organizations led by Indigenous and Black communities for the youth of their communities. So OTF's mission is to build healthy and vibrant communities throughout Ontario by investing in community-based initiatives and strengthening the impact of Ontario's nonprofit sector. As Marcel kind of alluded to, we are that government body that doesn't have as much flexibility to really radically change our granting. We have to be kind of within the confines of our MOU with the government. So we have to fund organizations that have a direct impact in their communities. They need to be incorporated as a registered charity or nonprofit for at least a year. We have some financial eligibility, and we need to have up-to-date records included with applications. They have to operate in Ontario, have more than 3 board members. And again, as Marcel was talking about operational funding, we do fund projects, or we did prior to COVID. Municipalities under 20,000 people are eligible, for, generally speaking, for our funds, but the MUSH sector is not. We have some structures and processes in place where we do kind of try and decentralize the way that we fund grants. So we have now 6 different regions, 17 catchments across those 7 regions that each have their own grant review teams and their own dedicated staff. So the program managers at OTF would review the applications that would then go to the volunteers for that catchment, which would then go to these grant review teams at each deadline. They make the recommendations, that goes to the board approves those grants, and then it goes to the ministry for announcements. So the reason I say this is because some of what I would consider the best practices in granting, including operational funding, including rolling deadlines, including things like being really flexible and doing things as quickly as possible. We have some kind of structural things in place that make that really difficult for OTF. So speed really is not our strong suit, but we do have quite broad reach. So that's kind of the trade-off. We are a large grantor, but we can't pivot quite as quickly as some of the smaller foundations. Prior to COVID, we had a 10-year investment strategy where we were investing in 6 different action areas: active people, connected people, green people, inspired people, promising young people, and prosperous people. We granted to these 6 different action areas through 3 different types of grants. So we had seed grants, which were under 25,000 for kind of proof of concept type of things. Grow grants, which were much larger. They were over up to 3 years and up to $750,000. Those really needed to be evidence-based, and the intention was really to kind of scale things that had been had a good strong evidence base for being proven effective types of work in the community. And then we had capital grants. So we have prior to COVID, we are guilty of some of those things that I think a lot of grantees don't love. Things like extensive reporting. We had a more involved application process. So some of those things that were kind of like pretty persistent throughout, I think, funders across the nonprofit and charitable sector. So this is kind of like, this is where we were, you know, like 15 months ago, or even 12 months ago. With the onset of COVID, there was, I would say, like, obviously the organization goes, okay, well, what do we do now? How are our grantees going to be impacted? What should we do with kind of like our upcoming granting programs? You know, initially, I think like everybody, we thought it would be a matter of weeks or at the most a couple of months that we would be dealing with COVID. And I think as that became clear over kind of the first 3 weeks of the pandemic, that this was something that was going to be really much more foundationally disruptive to our lives, our societies, and the sector that we were serving, that we really needed to make a strong change to how we were granting. We would have to reallocate I think we had 84 million left in our annual granting budget. So that's where, you know, people don't love surveys until they want your data to make some decisions. So we had the organization looking to our measurement team asking, what should we do? Where should we put this money? And, you know, what's happening in the sector? So we kind of broke it down into 3 broad research questions to help us get at these kind of the 2 at the bottom, which was ultimately, we want to know, like, how do we invest to have the greatest impact with the context of COVID-19, and how do we measure recovery of the sector from COVID-19? So those research questions were kind of 3 different, I like to think of them as like kind of Zooms. So we needed to know what was going on in the communities that the nonprofit sector serves. We wanted to know how the organizations themselves were being impacted. And then we wanted to know also what funders were doing, so that we weren't all reacting to the same kind of, organizational or community data in the same way and maybe missing some gaps. So for this first question, we really had a hard time answering this. And I would say, like, ultimately, we still are not really able to answer this question. We kind of collected things from a hodgepodge. So we were also trying to do this over quite a short period of time, I would say last April or May. We used, that should be the ONN flash survey, as well as the state of the sector survey, to look at which subsectors we're seeing an increase in demand, and kind of using that as a proxy for the impacts in the community or the community need. We also reached out to some partners at 201 to ask like if they had seen any change in the type of requests or calls that they were getting, to get a sense of what the community directly was reaching out for. And then we were really trying to lean on organizations that we had existing relationships with, either organizations or partners of ours or other funders, to find out if they had any surveys in the field, or if they had anything that they could share from their constituents, to kind of give us a sense of what they were hearing from their communities, for us to be able to kind of see what was most prevalent, and if we could make any sense of it. And then just general media or news articles. So I think it's no surprise to anybody looking at the sector surveys, we found that social services and health sectors were really the ones that were seeing a huge increase in demand. Food security, food banks, they were really, really strained, especially towards the beginning of the pandemic. Domestic violence was something that came up as an issue that was exacerbated by the impacts of COVID-19 or the stay-at-home orders, as well as just generally across the communities. We were seeing greater social isolation, physical inactivity, mental health. These were things that we were seeing come up both anecdotally and in survey findings. But ultimately, to answer this question, we really weren't able to. So ultimately, when we started looking at how we were going to pivot our funding, this wasn't a very good, we didn't have anything really strong to base any changes or use this in any real instructive way. So we looked to somewhere that we could get a little bit better sense of the data with a bit more fulsome kind of sources. So this was looking at the impact of COVID-19 on the sector or on organizations and how they were able to operate. We worked with ONN and AFO to put out a survey in the field in June. We were able to collect 1,131 responses, which was great. So these, I can go through a couple of the stats and some of our findings. I think most people would be familiar with this. The couple caveats to this is that it is a convenient sample, so it wasn't representative. And we didn't really have any way to ensure that we were getting the voice of like small grassroots, rural, or kind of organizations that weren't already kind of in not necessarily the inner circle, but were connected to us. So they may be underrepresented in these survey findings. And kind of ultimately what we found were that for the most part, the nonprofit sector continued to find a way to serve their constituents. That almost 60% had adapted to virtual within the first 3 months of the pandemic. But that this wasn't necessarily the case across the board. So certain subsectors had a harder time by virtue of just like the nature of their programming. So arts and culture and sports and rec really had a harder time adapting to virtual. So less than half of those organizations were able to actually adapt their programs to virtual. And we were also seeing really much higher rates of closure or temporary closure compared to the other subsectors. Virtually across the board, organizations were impacted financially. The outlook was pretty poor. There were 1 in 5 saying that they didn't think they could last 6 more months. And what we took away from this at OTF was that the need was pretty ubiquitous, like across the sector. Organizations really were feeling this financially. But the financial hit at this time wasn't gigantic for each organization. So if we could get money out quickly and kind of into as many hands as possible, that would hopefully support kind of the resilience and the rebuilding of the sector. So from that survey, we found that the average loss per organization was about 123,000. So the majority of organizations were experiencing losses under 100K. And with 84 million left in our funding budget, we could hopefully get, as much reach as possible across the sector. We also saw that not all organizations were experiencing this the same in terms of demand. So we saw that social services, health and development and housing really were seeing a higher increase in demand than things like the arts and culture and sports and rec sectors that weren't able to were less of one of those basic services in the sector. So all of this to say, in May, our granting team and kind of an interdepartmental group got together to go through a sprint exercise to basically go, okay, well, with this data that we have available, what are we going to do? We wanted to reduce the admin burden as much as possible. So we do have some requirements. We have to make sure that organizations meet our eligibility, but we tried to really streamline that application process as much as possible so that it would be accessible to more of the grassroots and kind of less professionalized organizations. We made our grants relatively small, so under 150K, to try and get to as many organizations as possible. And we felt like that was kind of a good balance to meet what we had seen in the flash survey and the state of the sector survey. We wanted to position ourselves as this being recovery funding. So the outcomes intended for this fund was really at the organization level and was about how they were going to use this money to adapt their organization's either programming or kind of structures to make sure that they were going to be able to kind of weather this. We really didn't think that emergency funding made sense for us because OTF, like I said, speed is not really our strength. And there were a number of other funders that were really trying to meet that kind of emergency funding target. So we also use this as an opportunity to collect data without really overburdening. So we were trying to use the application as kind of a data collection mechanism as well, without overburdening with another survey or with additional kind of data collection intentions. So we asked about the impacts of COVID-19, which we were able to segregate then by region, demographic, and subsector, as well as the needs of the organization, which we kind of used the outcomes they were selecting as a surrogate. And then we will ultimately be collecting this in the final reports as well to be able to kind of use as hopefully a measure of how the sector is recovering. So through this 1 year granting term, where's the sector come? Where are we still falling short? And again, we can do that by region, demographic, and subsector. So this was the Resilience Communities Fund. We've extended it to this upcoming fiscal year as well. So overall, it'll be over $150 million that we will grant to the nonprofit sector. It is OTS standard eligibility, but we've also added the Ontario mandate as an additional catchment so that we're able to support some of those organizations that don't necessarily operate in one specific region. They're $150,000 grants for a 1 year term, intended to really help organizations make the changes necessary to help them kind of weather this COVID-19 storm. So they can select more than one outcome, but the outcomes that the fund is looking to support are adapting and reimagining programs, procuring equipment to either renovate spaces or do what they need to do to continue programming and abide by, obviously, the public health restrictions, develop new streams of revenue generation, equip staff and board with new strategies. So this might be like pivoting how they do their work, and then creating new partnerships and collaborations. So from our applications data, we found that the majority of organizations were operating under 70% capacity. That's not surprising. I think probably the biggest takeaway actually from these stats is that there was a gigantic demand. So we had 4,300 applications over two rounds. Our typical application numbers would be around 700 prior to COVID. Our highest, I think, was about 1,000. So to see, 1,600 applications in one round, and then I think 2,600 in the next round, it was really the need across sectors was really evident. And we were seeing organizations that had never applied for OTF funding before. So either that speaks to kind of the more general nature of the fund, or that there was just like such demand in the sector that we were seeing people kind of come from all over. Not surprisingly, most of what we found from the application data collection aligned with the ONN State of the Sector survey. We were finding that organizations were really struggling to generate revenue, to meet demands for services, and to deliver their program and deliver on their mission. And most organizations, speaking to kind of that resilience, were trying to adapt their programs to be able to continue programming and serving their communities throughout the pandemic. From the budget breakdown we were seeing, for the most part, we were really supporting either salaries of existing staff or consultants, so purchase services, as well as capital. So this is kind of what it looks like at OTF. We have a number of different dashboards that help us kind of slice and dice. We also have another one looking at our assessments to start to see where we are funding and where maybe we're not funding as much. And then that goes to the granting team to change, not necessarily like the structure of the fund, but it might change how we do outreach or that kind of thing, or look at some of our policies or how we're enacting our policies and our assessments. So this is just an idea of kind of like what data looks like at OTF and how much we really do use it a lot. We try to make it as accessible as possible for our granting team and our senior leadership. So our takeaways from this were really, there's a gigantic need for funding. Generating revenue is still a huge challenge. And there are some organizations, especially those that are serving what we would call like priority populations, that are experiencing kind of this trifecta of increased demand, increased expenses, and reduced revenue. We also saw that a lot of organizations were having kind of an existential crisis that was leaving them unable to deliver on their mission. So a lot of organizations were selecting delivering on their mission, just being able to do what they exist to do. And this wasn't the same across all sectors, but we were definitely seeing this for some of them that weren't able to pivot their programming as well. We were trying to provide funds as quickly as possible with as few restrictions and as few strings attached as possible, but just given the some of the constraints that we have because of our MOU, it's not always possible, but it's definitely something that I would recommend to other funders. And I think I'm just kind of reiterating what Marcel was saying. But also, without better sector data, we really have a hard time of understanding who isn't getting funding and who isn't applying. Which brings me to kind of this last piece, which is how are funders responding? Or I think what I was supposed to be talking about in this presentation was what's the role of funders in rebuilding? And I mean, from where I sit as the Director of Measurement, Evaluation, and Business Intelligence, I come back to data and providing data, providing both the mechanisms and the tools for data to be collected as well as used by the sector. I think I'm close to time here. So I can speak to what we're trying to do to kind of address this or to make steps forward on this at OTF. We're really trying to improve our use of community data. The difficulty is that it's not very easily accessible and the mechanisms of collection are slow. So things like the census that happen every 4 years, it's kind of hard to see like what emergent needs there are from community when we're not going to see necessarily in real time the impact of COVID-19 on community needs, like which we would take from like income or housing or that kind of thing. So our first step at OTF is just to, we're working with another group to create a dashboard that just is a map of demographics across Ontario. So it's an interactive map that we're able to toggle between different kind of granularity geographically to then see kind of what the proportional population is of our different priority demographics. So if we're looking at how we have funded organizations serving the Black community, we need to know what the size of that Black community is in a particular region, because we do fund all over Ontario. We're also trying to improve the data that we have related to the sector. So we've been using our RCF applications, and we will be using our final reports as well as much as possible, but that only tells us about the organizations that are in touch with OTF. So without some kind of common repository or mechanism, it makes it pretty difficult. But so we've really been leaning on kind of the reports coming out of either ONN, which we're working with them, and then also Imagine Canada. But we really need something to just tell us who's in the sector. So right now we don't really have a good idea of who's even out there. And kind of to be able to look at recovery, it's hard to say when you kind of have a moving target or you're building on moving on shifting land. So what we are hoping to do, but is still very much in the works, is build a mapping tool of the organizations in the sector. So what they do, who they serve, and where they work. Basically those kind of three aspects with, again, an ability to toggle between different granularity of region. And then funder data. So this is one that we actually like. For the most part, funders have data.
Yeah, I can ask you to just sort of finish up the presentations as we're a bit over time at this point.
Yep, this is my last point.
Okay.
So this is data that we have, and we actually just need to share it, or we at least need to have some kind of common data standard to be able to bring it into a place that we can use each other's data. So we aren't working in silos, which sounds so cliche, but it really is true that we collect data for our own purposes, which is generally not exactly the same as under other funders, but it's pretty close, or it's close enough that we could really probably reduce the burden of collection, but also we could probably work towards starting to coordinate a little bit if we were able to just do a little bit better job of just sharing data and kind of coordinating how we collect data and what we use it for. All right, that's it from me.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. And I'm sure we can go back to the details at the end of the session. So I would now like to give the floor to Ruth Cramond from the United Way to tell us a bit more about their experience. And Ruth, I will turn on my video 2 minutes before your time is up, just as a reminder to sort of conclude your presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Isadora. And I think Catherine has my slides maybe to share. That'd be great. So I'm really glad to be here and talk with you, and it's nice to see some friends on the call. And I wish we were all in a room together so we could actually have a really good conversation about this, because a bit like Marcel said, I don't necessarily think United Ways or United Way Greater Toronto is doing this better, but we've certainly learned a great deal through the pandemic. And I'm happy to share some of what we've learned with all of you. I want to cover a number of issues, actually, talking a bit about how we've been using data and research to inform our investments, also pre-pandemic, how we evolved our funding approach through the pandemic. And, you know, we've done that before the pandemic, but what did we learn during the pandemic so that we're seeing some emerging opportunities, I think, to think about how we use our old approaches in combination with new approaches, and maybe even thinking about how we use them differentially depending on how we want to support the recovery and try to create a stronger community service ecosystem going forward. And I saw there was a question in the chat, are we rethinking, is this a chance to reimagine our granting? And I think it very much is. So next slide, I'll start just with a little bit about United Way. I think many of you might be familiar with United Ways across the country, and you can go to the next slide. We're a large funder, but we also cover a vast territory. So many of you probably know that we run an annual fundraising campaign in United Way Greater Toronto. We provide then grants to organizations across Peel, Toronto, and York, with over $80 million going out into community work annually. So we are the largest non-government funding funder in the GTA. But again, we're still small relative to government, and we're still a part of that funding ecosystem with so many of you that are on this call. I think the other function that we have in addition to granting is bringing people together, whether it be academic partners, related to our research or donors and volunteers. And as Julian described, we always have volunteers involved in our funding processes. We've become very, very focused and clear about our intentions to address poverty and to try to alleviate poverty, find pathways out of poverty, and address some of the underlying causes of poverty in the GTA. The way in which we work with our network of services and government partners, I think has become more and more relevant through the pandemic. So maybe I'll just go to the next slide. I think one of the things we found through the pandemic for sure is that our approach pre-pandemic is a great foundation for what we've seen, the patterns and the issues that we're seeing in the pandemic. So some of the work that Marcel spoke about, the network of services that we fund became very critical to mobilize in terms of community response and to intersect with the health system and other bigger systems to actually address the needs during the pandemic. We've also seen, though, that this network of services does need some help and support in coordinating, and some help and support. It's identifying the issues on the ground, but it needs a little support in linking with the bigger system players, local governments, even provincial, even federal governments, as well as some of the other big systems players, for example, in healthcare. And that became an important role for United Way during this pandemic. And the way in which we were able to leverage our government relations and public policy work, I think, was pretty important. The other thing that we absolutely found in the GTA especially, but I think this is true actually in other jurisdictions as well, is that the intersections of poverty, equity and reconciliation, and geographic poverty were critical and started to really come to the surface during the pandemic. So if you go to the next slide, one of the things that United Way is known for is its relational funding and its longer term funding. This is a funny slide we did from some network research that we did a couple of years ago as we were trying to make the case for relational funding for general operating support for a strong foundational network of agencies that is linked and connected in order to address poverty. So this was just a visual out of that network research that we did with many of our what we call anchor agencies, so that we could see they were very well networked. And this visual presented that. So going to the next slide. Sorry, I'm skipping around a little, but just coming back to talk about, we've been talking about neighborhood inequalities at United Way Greater Toronto since 2005 with what I would say was a seminal report called Poverty by Postal Code, where we started to say that poverty was concentrating in particular neighborhoods, and where you lived was starting to have a real effect on your opportunities for the future. So, you know, we've always partnered, United Way's always partnered with academic organizations, for example, David Hilchansky at University of Toronto, or we did some research on precarious employment, which has been super relevant during the pandemic with Wayne Luchek at McMaster. So those kinds of historic reports, starting in 2005, going right up before the pandemic, actually were already pointing to those growing inequalities, which became so super clear during the pandemic. So if you can go to the next slide. In particular, these three reports that our research team generated just pre-pandemic, one of them, you know, bringing the neighborhoods inequality to work, well, two of them really focusing on neighborhood inequality. The third one starting to talk about equity and reconciliation issues and the way in which certain populations, particularly racialized people, women, and youth, were being left behind in the prosperity in the GTA. So if you go to the next one, just the last slide, a visual on that, where you can see in these reports, this was from our opportunity equation research, where in 1980, the blue neighborhoods represent high income neighborhoods, the yellow middle income, and the red low income. And you can see what happened from 1980 even to 2010, and that trend has continued, where we have more high income neighborhoods, more low income neighborhoods, and fewer middle income neighborhoods in the GTA. We also saw that this is true in other larger regions, Calgary, Vancouver, and Montreal for sure. And we're starting to see some of that, for example, in Peel region through the pandemic. So what do we do in the pandemic? Let me take you to the pandemic story for us. The first thing that we did right away was offer flexibility to all of our funded agencies. We said, whatever we were funding you for pre-pandemic, never mind, you tell us what is most important, what needs to be done right now. You know, you could take your early years funding if you're not able to deliver and move it to food systems. You could tell us that it's other infrastructure that you need right now. You just talk to us and we'll be super flexible with the funding, the longer term, the 3 or 5 year grants that we're giving you to be able to deliver on the ground. We historically were known as a long range funder, but I think what we also learned was what was good about that. How do we leverage those relationships? But also, what else could we do to be to bring what Julian talked about, speed and responsiveness to our approach, and how do we work a bit more with some of the grassroots organizations that were also effective in being able to get to people and populations during the pandemic. So back in March, one of I think probably the best things for us was these clusters or community groups. Tables that we formed. Back in March, some sector leaders called us and said, oh my God, the libraries are closing. Everything is closing. Where are people going to go? Where are they going to go for their food? Where are they going to go for their internet access? What's going to actually happen to the people that we're serving? People were so confused. Are we open? Are we closed? What are the safety procedures? What's happening from the emergency response table at the city and the region of Peel, region of York? So we formed these cluster tables, and they were co-convened by United Way and the City of Toronto. And that was where we pulled our real-time data. What's happening today? What's happening tomorrow? We were meeting 3 times a week with the clusters. What are you learning? What are you seeing? Who's being left out? How do you need to work together? Someone needs a van. Somebody else has food. How is everybody going to coordinate? What's the healthcare system doing? The community health centers were at the table. And we've continued with those clusters throughout the pandemic, and we're still using them as resources and data and way to operationalize on the ground as we move through the pandemic. You know, simultaneously, we ended up putting out a lot of small and emergency grants through our local Love Fund last summer, many of them going to grassroots groups. So we were actually managed to do speed, which we've not really done very well in the past as United Way. We tend to be in for the long game, lots of volunteers, lots of process, it takes us time to get our grants out the door, but we were able to turn those around really fast. And then I see that Dan Clement's on the call with United Way Canada. We were able to distribute over $20 million in the GTA of emergency federal funding, emergency community support funding to the GTA agencies. Within a couple of months, we were able to turn those grants around and get them out on the ground. So we kind of surprised ourselves with our ability to do speed. So I'm going to skip over this slide in the interest of time, but just to say, given our research, if you keep going through with those slides, oh, you got to catch up with me. Couple more, one more. There we go. Sorry, I haven't been helping trigger the slide. We do believe the geographic distribution where programs are located is pretty important. Local responses are critical, connecting grassroots groups to those responses. We have to get to equity-seeking groups. They're the people most affected by the pandemic and most affected by poverty. There's clearly an intersection there, and we need to look at system solutions. So my last couple of comments before my time runs out is that we, if you could go to back up to the slide with the blue there. I think what we learned is maybe we need different kind of granting approaches to address different problems in the ecosystem. And maybe we need an ecosystem of community services. So we need some rapid response. We need connections with grassroots groups, maybe smaller grants, lower barrier, less data required, less thorough investigation into the governance, the financial management, the details of the organization to get money out on the ground. For example, in the local love fund, I think it was something like 66% of the agencies we funded there were trusteed. So a lot of grassroots groups there. Then the emergency community support funding I talked about, that the federal funding we distributed, a little bigger grants, $50,000 to $100,000. So we wanted a little more information about the agency's ability to deliver, as well as what they hope to accomplish. About 12% of those were trusteed organizations. And then the network of agencies where we want, 3, 5 longer term grants. We want to build the infrastructure. We want to give them general operating support or unrestricted dollars, more flexibility with their dollars. We need to know they have an infrastructure to deliver. And in this case, our last round pre-pandemic, about 7% of our network of agencies are trusteed, which indicates they may not meet all our requirements, but might be delivering on some great programs. And so we learned a lot about how to work with trustees and trusteed organizations. And I think some of what was coming up around how do we work with some key places like, I think you were referring to, is it Pivot in London, but other ONN, some of our other partners, and some great agencies that are doing good capacity building and support work with smaller organizations. And how do we foster partnerships between those smaller organizations and maybe the foundational organizations or ecosystem that provides stability for the sector? So I think that's maybe where I'll stop. Maybe my last slide are some sort of questions for all of us. How do we ensure that we've got larger organizations that can provide the stability, decent work, system solutions? How are we supporting them? How do we diversify that leadership so it is really in touch with what's happening on the ground? And I think a lot of our organizations were during the pandemic, but some maybe not better than others. How do we strengthen some equity-led, focused and serving partners to join that foundational group with longer term, deeper grants? And then grassroots, when should we fund them? I've talked to Jihad Laidlaw about this and to some of you on this call. When can they reach communities that aren't well served? When do they fill in gaps? When should they not turn into organizations? Because they're better to be nimble and less bound by charitable requirements and infrastructure. So we're watching with interest the bill tabled by Senator Omidyar, Bill S222, I think. And United Way Canada has come out in favor of some of the flexibility recommended in some of her changes exactly on this work, and I see some stuff going up in the chat there. But I think as funders, we've got a bit of push and pull, like are we going to give bigger, longer grants in the foundational structure, or more grants to more agencies, spread our funding thinner to more and smaller organizations? It's always a bit of a tension. I think we probably need to do both and to be working together as a philanthropic sector to figure out how to do that. So I'll close there and hope there might be some opportunity for conversation.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Ruth. And yeah, perhaps I can invite Julian and Marcel to also put their cameras on. And we already have some questions in the chat, but everyone is welcome to just add their questions and comments. Maybe you want to just put a Q when you're adding a question, just for clarity. And if you want to provide a question or comment yourself, just put in your name or type a question, and I will give you the opportunity to speak as well. So the first one to Marcel from Jean-Marc Fontan. You mentioned at least 3 important elements, Marcel. What needs to be done? You spoke about trust philanthropy and about the paradigm shift. This seems to represent a strong appeal to transform the present identity of the grant-making sector. Do you think that the pandemic has set the table for a small revolution in grant-making?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Jean-Marc. Something I've been thinking about for a while. I think it certainly has put a spotlight on a number of issues that were just raised by Julian and Ruth. For sure, a revolution for me is a big word. Many years ago, I was trained as an historian, so I'm always a bit careful about announcements that things will change rapidly. First of all, things don't change because of one or just a series of events. If they change, it's usually because it was already changing before those events actually happened. And I remember, the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, which I'm not comparing at all to the pandemic, of course, but it was difficult at that point too for organizations. And I remember foundations and organizations saying, we're going to collaborate more, things are going to change. And I would say 6 months after, we were pretty much back to where we were. I don't want to be over cynical. I think the pandemic is much bigger, and I think it will help change for sure. Revolution, I don't know. I hope so, Jean-Marc, that it really will bring in big change, but I'd be a bit careful about saying it's going to be a revolution. But I think things are going in the right direction. And I guess what I was trying to say in my presentation also is we will need to be, I think we're doing some really good stuff in the private foundation world for sure, but we need to continue to be pushed by the sector and by our partners to do more and to think differently. Even if we have more flexibility perhaps than the Trillium Foundation or United Way, we still can be really caught up in our processes. So we need to be pushed.
Thank you, Marcel. Ruth or Julian, would you like to add anything to this?
I would maybe just add that I think I don't know, I don't know what the pace of change will be. I don't know without measures of accountability to that change. I don't know how quickly it will happen, but I would say that what maybe 2 or 5 years ago would have seemed like really radical, like out there kind of takes on the sector or on philanthropy in general, I think are becoming a bit more normalized, like in general and within the philanthropic sector. Certainly, like from a funder perspective, we start to recognize like there really are some structural issues in how the whole thing is set up. And so what do we do without, like a burn it down kind of revolution? What are some levers that we can kind of pull to start course correcting a little bit? So whether it's kind of decentralizing decision making and that kind of trust-based philanthropy about giving power to the people, whether it's like the communities themselves or the organizations, to have a bit more self-determination in how they spend the money, what they think the outcome should be, that kind of thing, instead of I'm definitely guilty of it. I sit in a seat where I'm trying to demonstrate impact according to like basically a rubric that's so top down. So I think that we are going to see a change. I think there's appetite to make it a bit more decentralized and a little bit more community centered and community driven. I won't get caught up in the semantics of revolution. I don't have a historical background. I'm a physiologist, so I don't know if I will call it a revolution, but I do think that there's winds of change.
Thank you.
I think what's really interesting about this conversation, and again, it would be lovely to have more time really just to have conversation, because I think there is the philanthropic sector has to have some tough conversations about impact driven, even the word driven, approach versus organic approach and trust-based philanthropy. I think when the funders are defining the impacts and the outcomes, just Julian's referring to within a rubric, or we only fund this to do this for these reasons, and we need to see these outcomes, and they have to be rolled up, and you have to report in this particular way so we can roll up the impacts to show to our donors or our, that goes a little contrary to a more community development approach, which is a more ground up approach where the organization says, this is what's really needed. And every organization and what we learn is, what's needed in North Etobicoke is very different than what's needed maybe in Scarborough, or for, gender-based violence, it's very different than what might be needed for, middle years programs after school. And yet we're always being asked to roll up, where did you move the needle? How do you roll that all up? And we're saying, well, each organization defines its own outcomes and impacts, and it doesn't roll up neatly in a rubric or a move the needle report. So I think that's a challenge. Like, what do we mean by impact funding? What does outcome reporting look like? So I think as we wrestle those things, we could move more to a trust-based philanthropy. But there's sometimes competing demands on the grantors, right, to deliver on both of those.
I think also to that point, the current sort of burden is on grantees to fit our structures, our idea of what change should look like. And part of that is because if we make it, like a free-for-all, not that it is a free-for-all, but if it's not organized by our investment strategies or our funding theory of changes, that sort of top-down organization of things, then the burden is on us to make sense and organize the outcomes that they give us. And I think that's like, we're trying to find where is that happy medium where we're able to organize the outcomes that they're providing, but we're also providing the flexibility for them to kind of determine what those are.
Thank you. Marcel, would you like to add?
Yeah, I just like this conversation. There's a lot of rhetoric out there, right, about how we need to do this, and I use it myself. But it's not easy. It's not easy. And there's things that you're going to lose. I mean, we talked a lot about in this session about data and the importance of good data and impact. And we increasingly, particularly in the work that we do with our Indigenous colleagues, it's very much community driven, the work that we do around diabetes in northern communities. And we know that that's the way we need to do it, but we have to rethink the way we do things. But it doesn't mean that everything we were doing was not was wrong. There's some of the stuff that we were doing actually that worked well. I mean, there is I think there is good analysis of some good philanthropic approaches. I mean, we're not at a point where we're inventing everything and throwing everything out. So I think that's difficult to appear, and we want to be open and we want to listen. At the same time, we want to keep some of our, so it's, I know I'm not helping the conversation probably, but simply to say that we need to have these candid conversations, not only between funders, but between funders and partners, and try to get to a point where things will make more sense, and where I think it won't necessarily be a one size fits all, but at least to start having these candid conversations, which I think we have not had. Maybe there's a revolution there.
Okay, thank you so much. So just to summarize, in a way, we are seeing that changes are happening in the way that grant making for the foundations are doing things. And sometimes these changes are maybe not completely new. Some of these things were already there, were already in the play, but perhaps they have gotten new urgency or maybe even become more visible right now. And that this is a process, and in a way, it requires a conversation between the various stakeholders in the philanthropic ecosystem to sort of to move things from where we are to where we want to get. Now, there is a question in the chat. I'm assuming this is for Julian from Francois. Which practical actions should be taken to consolidate the existing data on the sector and to identify the gaps?
We're just also kind of having a little sidebar chat. I think what we're trying to do, like in the immediate term, so in like a matter of like months, hopefully, is to sort of like hem together the existing data on the sector. So we've been talking about T3010 data in the chat. We are hopefully going to be involved with a group to build a dashboard to be able to visualize and like interact with T3010 data well, they've already built it, but we want to be able to incorporate the nonprofit sector as well. So, and that was that point that I had about like understanding who is out there, what they're doing, and who they're serving, so that we can start to get a sense. Again, it comes like from our standpoint before we take actions to determine kind of where we're maybe missing groups or missing certain communities, is understanding who is there first. So I think the two answers to that, one is hopefully making sense of the T3010 data and other available data to understand just those basics about organizations and where they are and who they're serving. And then the other is obviously making data available as funders. I know, well, I mean, it's not out of the goodness of my heart that I have to post our grants data because we are bound by the open data directive of the provincial government. But just starting a movement of like sharing what we have. I feel like we all collect a lot of data and it often doesn't make it outside of our walls. So if we can come together and figure out at least what the barriers are to sharing data with each other, finding out where we're actually collecting some of the same data, and then maybe creating some kind of plan or strategy to understand like where can we actually be sharing and having a broader repository of what is out there to have a more fulsome picture. So those, I guess, are kind of the two practical things I might suggest.
This is excellent. Thank you so much. And I think one of the conversations we are having tomorrow on the second panel, in the first panel actually, is really what are some priorities that different stakeholders can unite around. And I think that what we're just talking about is actually an important priority in order to be able to really elicit a change in the sector. Okay, so question from Manuel in Italian in the chat. Similar to what we were just saying. So any appetite on creating a centralized database for the sector? And I think it's supported by David Lasby.
Yeah, I mean, like for OTF, we have to provide our grants data back to the ministry. And they're building a central database called the Transfer Payment Ontario database. So that should exist in some open data format, but that's obviously only grants given through various agencies of the Government of Ontario. So something that was centralized for the whole sector. Yeah, I would say that I have an appetite for that.
Excellent. Then perhaps this is one thing that people can follow up on after this session. Great. Okay, we have a little bit more time for questions or comments. So if anyone would like to add or sort of ask a question, just please add your comments to the chat. And I will give the floor to Marcel now.
One thing we haven't talked about that goes also to what Julian and Ruth were saying in terms of grassroots organizations and community driven, et cetera, is the recommendation from the Senate report, and of course from the advisory committee to the CRA also. Charity, I see that Hillary's on the line, around moving beyond the traditional qualified donees, right? So the ability of funders, I don't know, I imagine that would be difficult for Trillium Foundation, Julian, because of what kind of organization you are, I don't know, but certainly for private foundations, the ability to be able to fund those organizations that are qualified donees, certainly Indigenous, but not only Indigenous, a lot of smaller grassroots would be a real step in the right direction. So that would almost be, going back to Jean-Marc, that almost be a revolution to be able to get beyond the qualified donee, where Canada is one of the few countries where we're so, our hands are so tied in terms of how we want to do or need to do our work.
Thank you. Ruth or Julian, would you like to add something to that?
Well, just that I mentioned that at the end of my presentation, I would agree with Marcel that that's definitely something where we're so restricted by that. I do think in addition, we did learn through the pandemic some ways of enabling grassroots organizations, even in absence of those changes in legislation. And I think, partnering with foundational organizations that are willing to take a leadership role in supporting the others and trying to do that in a way. I know there's a lot of concern about the colonial nature of trustees, but I think being able to do that carefully with the right kind of trustee partners. We were able actually to get some good money out to the number of Black communities through some Black focused agencies who acted as trustees and partnered with us, and were able to distribute some of that federal emergency money. So it wasn't perfect, but we're finding ways to work around it. But I would definitely agree with Marcel. Like, I think that's a place we need to be turning our attention to as a philanthropic sector to get behind these. There are some good recommendations that have been put forward, and supporting some of that work too.
We're in a similar boat. So like the one fund that I talked about, or that I've mostly talked about, which is our larger one, tends to be like closer to 100 million. And then we have a smaller one that's closer to like 30 million, which is the Youth Opportunities Fund. And we have a similar approach to supporting grassroots organizations, where they basically work with what we call an organizational mentor. And the org mentor meets our organization criteria and technically holds the funds, but it's the grassroots organization that then is the beneficiary of those dollars as they do their work in the organization in their communities.
And I was wondering, are there any specific steps any of your organizations is taking on maybe helping support these processes on a policy level when we're talking about, for example, unqualified donees, or how we gather data about the sector?
Well, we certainly have been supportive of those recommendations, like many other foundations have written letters, etc. But we also know that, again, I was talking about the importance of infrastructure umbrella organizations and the work that they do and how we need to support them. This is a good example of that, right? Their ability to do the policy work, to do the advocacy, rather than be Philanthropic Foundations Canada or Imagine Canada or ONN, etc. But there needs to be a push coming from the community. I think the time is right.
I would agree with Marcel. We're involved in this work through United Way Canada, it's part of Imagine Canada, and so on, advocating there on the centralized database. United Way Greater Toronto would love to be part of that. We've talked about that many times, locally and more broadly. It is a big undertaking. So I do think some of these efforts by the provincial and federal governments, like I think it needs some, to be honest, it needs some government muscle in there too. Just trying to do it on an ad hoc among various philanthropic organizations isn't going to do it. Most of the organizations we fund also get government money. So I think the muscle and the infrastructure that would be needed to actually build a proper shared database. I think we can participate. I don't know that we're the ones to lead, but that's just my personal opinion, knowing how stretched our resources are, and I know many others of you are in the same spot.
Definitely. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that some of these comments actually just feed back to the, to the question of, having a shared responsibility about advocating, about changing the sector, but also about the importance of actually investing in community organizations and sort of providing that operational support and capacity building for them to be actually able to take a bit stronger advocacy role. I think, Marcel, this is what you were talking about in the beginning, and then also connecting that to these intermediary organizations. Okay, so we have almost 10 more minutes. And I also have some questions from the presentations I was listening. So I could perhaps start with Marcel. You spoke a bit about trust-based philanthropy and about mutual accountability, and I was wondering if maybe you can share some practical ways in which your collaboration with grantees has changed in the context of these sort of bigger concepts, like specific steps you're taking or specific processes.
Well, one example I could give, I guess, is the work that we're doing with some of our Indigenous partners and colleagues in in northern Indigenous communities. The foundation has been involved in work around prevention of diabetes for 3 decades now. And I think we've done some really good work. We've funded research, we've funded community action research, we've funded community work, etc. Very little is changing in Indigenous communities. And we have figured out through leadership from our Indigenous colleagues that until it becomes community driven, until the community decides itself that this is an issue they want to address and this is how we want to address it, it's not going to change. So for us, it's been working very, very differently. So we're funding with our Indigenous partners in collaboration with the federal government, which is great to show their ability to be flexible. Also a solutions lab, which is led by our partners. We are funding it, but we're there at the table only as participants. And we are learning a lot. And I think, although it continues to be a huge challenge, just to give you a bit of an idea, if you're a young Indigenous person today, you're 20 years old, you've got an 80% chance of having type 2 diabetes during your life, and probably 10 or 15 years before non-Indigenous. So it's huge, it's an epidemic. So unless we get into this trust-based approach where they know way better than we do, even though we would consult with the best experts in the world, they know much better than we do how this can change. So that's one example of how we're moving into trust-based philanthropy. And it's not always easy, right? It's not always comfortable. I'm not suggesting that at all. We have to learn, and it's a lot of back and forth, but we're confident that this is the way to go. So that's one example.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. Yes, and so I was wondering, Ruth, in your presentation, you were talking about some of the changes you are making in your collaboration with grantees. If you look at these changes and as maybe temporary responses to the way things are right now, could you identify one thing that you would like to have sustained after, one changed or new practice that you would like to have sustained after on the longer term?
Yes, one. There are not maybe a revolution, but there are probably a few. So answering one is a hard one. But I would say we would like to sustain and deepen our partnerships with, as what was alluded to, some of those. They're not even necessarily intermediary in this case, but organizations that would enable deeper connections into grassroots groups in particular communities. And so I think we've built some new relationships even through the pandemic. We were in the process of building a number before, but I think some of them have gone further in the pandemic, and we'd love to think about how to sustain them. I would agree, we fund some sector serving organizations as well, but we've had a more limited number of those. And I think being able to think about how we broaden our reach through those organizations would be a really positive outcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Just perhaps one last question to Julian. You showed some really interesting data, and I hope we will be able to see more of sort of what you are currently building. But I was wondering, do you see that this data that you have gathered will, how will this affect, will this data actually affect the OTF approach in some major way, apart from filling up the sort of the knowledge gap at this point? Do you see any major changes to how work is being done in the foundation?
We certainly, the data that we collect is used, like, not necessarily the whole thing to redirect our granting funds, but every day, that's the business intelligence side of what my team does. We're either answering requests from our granting team or from other parts of the organization asking if we can share, how much we funded for this or what our approval rates are for that. The most immediate change will be often to our outreach strategy to make sure that we actually have, we're reaching those communities. Let's say if there's particular action areas or demographics that we're seeing really low application rates, that'll change how we do our outreach and potentially how we open up coaching spots to make sure that those groups have the opportunity to get really good support in developing a good application. But I think the intention with what we've collected or what we put into kind of this data collection strategy embedded within our applications and final reports is to be able to act on it. Like, I haven't been at OTF all that long. I've only been here for about a year and a half, and really my like MO is collecting data that we can use. I really hate collection for collection's sake. We're trying to figure out how to use text-based analytics to make more out of our out of some of those open-ended questions that we have. Everything from like organization profiles to missions to project descriptions that we can't really use right now. I am very much anticipating that the data that we've been collecting will inform where we go moving forward. Part of that is kind of how we position it to our senior leadership and the board about either like, if it's a drastic change, which like OTF doesn't really do drastic changes all that well. I will say for RCF, we did do quite a big pivot, and that was something that across the organization, people were really proud of that, and trying to make it really sector oriented and user friendly and that kind of thing. And some of the barriers that we hadn't really been, or shackles we hadn't quite been able to rid ourselves of. So I guess the short answer is yes, I do very much anticipate that maybe so I can sleep at night. I expect that people will hopefully use my data, but it's in plan for me to basically put a report together for our board to begin the strategic discussions that'll inform kind of the next 1 to 3 years of our granting.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. I think we're nearing the end of our conversation. I would really like to thank the three of you for a really interesting talking points and lots of knowledge that you shared. And I think that yeah, some interesting conclusions are coming out of this, and a very important one on around, for example, building a platform, a collaborative platform around data in the sector. So I really hope that something will come out of this. So I would like to thank everyone here. This has been a long day, but really excellent conversation. So thank you all very much.